When Prince Harry stepped off the plane in Toronto, the city was buzzing with anticipation. Cameras flashed, journalists scribbled notes, and social media lit up with excitement. The Duke of Sussex had traveled to Canada not for a royal gala, not for a charity luncheon, but to honor Canadian veterans, men and women who had risked their lives for their country, for freedom, for people they would never know. He was supposed to be celebrated, applauded, and respected. After all, Harry had always cultivated an image of a soldier, a man who understood service, sacrifice, and the weight of responsibility. But what happened when he reached out his hand to greet those very people would stun the world. Silence. Averted eyes. A refusal so subtle, yet so devastating it sent ripples across the event. And the question that immediately gripped everyone watching was simple, but terrifying. How had it come to this? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. This story begins not with a handshake, but with history. Prince Harry, born into the British royal family, had spent much of his life under the unforgiving gaze of the public eye. From his early days in military service to the founding of the Invictus Games, Harry had meticulously crafted a persona that balanced courage with compassion. Canadians had admired him. Veterans had embraced him. They believed in him. They trusted him. And yet, on this crisp Toronto morning, that trust seemed to evaporate before his eyes. The man who had once been hailed as a hero, who had been celebrated for bringing attention to wounded soldiers and their struggles, suddenly found himself alone in a crowd. Alone and rejected. Why did this happen? How could someone who had once been so deeply respected find himself in this position? And more importantly, what does it reveal about the delicate balance between celebrity and genuine connection, between public perception and reality? These are questions that we will explore in this video, but first, we need to understand the stakes. Prince Harry was not merely attending a public event. He was stepping into a world that demanded sincerity, respect, and humility. Veterans are not impressed by titles, nor swayed by media coverage. Their lives have been defined by sacrifice, by discipline, and by principles that are far more enduring than royal tradition. And on this day, Harry was about to learn, in the most public and humiliating way, that admiration could not be demanded, it had to be earned. The anticipation in Toronto had been palpable. Fans lined the streets, waving cameras and smartphones, eager to capture a moment with a prince who, in recent years, had become a symbol of both fascination and controversy. Reporters positioned themselves strategically, microphones poised, ready to capture every word, every expression. But there was a tension in the air that few could see at first glance. Beneath the surface excitement lay unease. Veterans, some of whom had served alongside Harry during his military tours or participated in Invictus events, had begun to express quiet skepticism. Social media chatter hinted at discontent. Whispers circulated about past grievances, moments where Harry's actions, intentions, or statements had fallen short of the authenticity expected by those who had given everything in service to their country. These whispers were the calm before the storm, the first signs that what should have been a celebratory visit might instead become a public rebuke. As Harry walked toward the venue, a sense of déjà vu must have settled over him. He had attended countless ceremonies, shake hands, photo ops, and interviews. Yet, this time, something felt different. There was a coldness in the way people looked at him, an almost imperceptible hesitation that grew more pronounced with every step. Security personnel flanked him on all sides, maintaining a protective buffer, but even they sensed the tension. Cameras captured the moment from multiple angles, each frame more revealing than the last. When Harry extended his hand to a veteran, expecting the customary handshake and smile, the veteran's eyes flickered downward. The hand went unshaken. Averted eyes met averted eyes. Silence fell over a moment that should have been filled with applause and affirmation. It was a quiet humiliation, subtle yet complete, and one that would dominate headlines and online discourse for days to come. But what was even more shocking was not just the rejection itself. It was the story behind it, a story rooted in a complex web of past grievances, perceived betrayals, and unmet expectations. And it is here, in this moment of tension, that our story truly begins. To understand the gravity of what happened in Toronto, we need to look back at the foundation of Harry's relationship with the military community. Harry's military service had been extensive and highly visible. From his early tours in Afghanistan to his later humanitarian efforts, he had cultivated a deep bond with service members. The Invictus Games, launched in 2014, were not merely a public relations endeavor. They were his way of giving back, of honoring those whose lives had been irrevocably changed by war. In Canada, the Games had resonated strongly, with local veterans participating enthusiastically and local communities embracing the event wholeheartedly. Harry's name had become synonymous with resilience, courage, and public advocacy for those who had given everything for their country. This legacy was now at stake. The handshake in Toronto was not just a gesture. It was a test, a measure of whether the trust, respect, and admiration he had accumulated over years could withstand the scrutiny of an evolving, critical public. And yet, there is a deeper layer to this story, one that extends beyond the handshake, beyond the headlines, and beyond the cameras. Harry's presence in Toronto was occurring at a time when public perception of him had become increasingly polarized. The Duke and Duchess of Sussex had navigated a series of highly publicized controversies, from the exit from royal duties known as Megxit, to legal battles, to the cancellation of lucrative deals. While some celebrated their independence and media savvy, others questioned their sincerity and the authenticity of their charitable efforts. The Canadian veterans who ignored Harry's handshake were not acting in isolation. Their actions were influenced by a combination of direct personal experiences, public discourse, and perhaps a sense of disillusionment. Their refusal was a statement, a refusal to separate image from substance, a refusal to reward celebrity at the expense of genuine respect. Imagine for a moment standing in Harry's shoes, the expectation of warmth, the anticipation of camaraderie, the carefully orchestrated optics of a royal visit. And then, the silence, the avoidance, the subtle rebuke that is felt far more powerfully than words could convey. For a man whose life has been defined by public perception, whose every move is scrutinized, whose identity is intertwined with both fame and service, this moment in Toronto was more than a minor embarrassment. It was a revelation, a mirror held up to show him not what the world saw, but what it truly thought. And that reflection was uncomfortable. It was honest, and it was unrelenting. The stakes are personal as well as public. Harry's connections to veterans are not abstract. They are deeply rooted in shared experiences, in mutual respect for sacrifice, and in the understanding of what it means to serve. For the veterans, the expectations were clear: integrity, humility, and a demonstration that admiration is earned, not claimed. When Harry's handshake was refused, it was not merely a slight. It was a message that he had, in some way, fallen short. Perhaps it was a reflection of past grievances. Perhaps it was a critique of current actions. Perhaps it was a combination of both. What we do know is that this moment captured a dramatic shift, one that would resonate far beyond the confines of the Toronto event. But there is more. The cameras did not capture everything. Behind the scenes, conversations, whispers, and gestures painted a fuller, more complex picture of the events that unfolded. The veterans' reactions were nuanced, layered, and informed by experiences that outsiders cannot fully understand. Security staff, aides, and even members of the press sensed a tension that went beyond protocol. And Harry himself, despite years of exposure to public scrutiny, appeared unsettled, as if he recognized that this was a moment he could not simply manage or spin. It was real, it was raw, and it was consequential. The story that followed the handshake was not just about embarrassment. It was about the collision between expectation and reality, between persona and authenticity, between past reputation and present perception. So what does this moment in Toronto truly signify? Is it simply a reflection of personal missteps, or is it emblematic of a broader narrative about celebrity, accountability, and public trust? As we explore this story, we will examine not only the handshake but the events that led to it, the responses that followed, and the implications for Prince Harry's ongoing relationship with veterans, the public, and even the royal family. We will delve into the layers of history, the emotional beats, and the nuanced interplay of loyalty, respect, and disappointment. By the end of this video, you will understand why a single handshake, or its refusal, can tell us so much about human behavior, reputation, and the consequences of actions both past and present. And here's the kicker. What happened after the cameras stopped rolling would shock everyone, even those closest to Harry. The public moment of silence was just the beginning. Behind the scenes, decisions were being made, alliances were being tested, and reputations, fragile as glass, were on the line. This Toronto event was not just a missed handshake, it was a turning point. It was a signal that admiration could no longer be assumed, that respect must be continually earned, and that the consequences of missteps are magnified when history, expectation, and scrutiny collide. And what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Have you ever extended your hand, expecting warmth, only to find it met with cold indifference? That's exactly what happened to Prince Harry on that fateful morning in Toronto. A moment that was supposed to be ceremonial, respectful, and even heartwarming, transformed into a scene of subtle but unmistakable humiliation. The cameras caught it, the crowd noticed it, and social media exploded with it. Yet the true weight of that rejected handshake went far beyond the flash of a shutter. Why did it happen? And what does it reveal about Harry, the man, versus Harry, the image? The venue was buzzing. A modern hall near the waterfront, polished floors reflecting the sunlight, banners celebrating Canadian veterans, and the Invictus Games lining the walls. Harry's motorcade rolled in, a carefully orchestrated procession that signaled importance and respect. But the atmosphere was electric with tension. Veterans, some decorated, some quietly proud of service no longer recognized by the wider public, lined the red carpet, not waving or smiling, but waiting, watching, judging. And in their eyes, one could already sense the uncertainty. Was this a prince who truly understood them, or a celebrity seeking applause? Harry approached, dressed in a charcoal suit, the subtle insignia of his military service pinned neatly. He extended his hand to greet the first veteran. It was meant to be a symbolic moment, a connection, a bridging of worlds. But the veteran looked down. His eyes flicked past Harry's extended hand, landing somewhere beyond the crowd. The handshake was ignored. Just like that, a line of history and mutual respect seemed to fracture in one silent act. Camera flashes captured the hesitation, journalists murmured to themselves, and the silence spread like wildfire. You have to imagine the internal shock. Harry, a man so accustomed to public adulation, must have felt the sting immediately. Perhaps he smiled nervously. Perhaps he thought the veteran was just distracted. But then it happened again, and again. A wave of subtle rejections rippled through the front row. Eyes averted, heads turned, hands not extended. The cold indifference of a few became the collective statement of many. And the message was clear: respect is not inherited. Respect is earned. But why? Why now? Why in Toronto, a city that had embraced the Invictus Games and his charitable efforts in the past? The answer lies in a complex tapestry of events, promises, and perceptions. Veterans are not swayed by titles. They are not impressed by celebrity. They are influenced by experience, history, and sincerity. And according to multiple sources, some veterans in that hall had lingering grievances. Perhaps it was a sense that Harry's recent actions, legal battles, and media maneuvers had shifted his focus from service to self-image. Perhaps it was disappointment over the cancellation of charitable events, perceived financial mismanagement, or the optics of celebrity overshadowing substance. Whatever the reason, the reaction was deliberate, measured, and precise, a silent judgment that no words could convey. The cameras, as they always do, told only part of the story. Behind the lens, aides and security staff tried to mask their concern, but tension was evident. Microphones caught snippets of conversation. "Did he expect this?" one aide muttered. "It's worse than I thought," whispered another. But the veterans themselves were unflinching. They were not performing for the cameras. They were not trying to send a message to the world. They were asserting their principles. And for Harry, the realization must have been brutal. The admiration he had relied on, nurtured, and celebrated was conditional. And in this moment, he was learning just how quickly that admiration could vanish. Imagine for a second standing in his shoes. You have traveled thousands of miles. You have polished your speech, rehearsed your smile, and prepared for a display of gratitude. You are ready to be welcomed, applauded, and remembered. And instead, you are met with silence. A refusal. A subtle yet unmistakable message. We do not acknowledge you. We do not honor you. We will not elevate you with our gestures. It is one thing to be criticized by the media, another to be silently rejected by the people you sought to honor. And yet, this is exactly what Harry faced. Not just disappointment, but a mirror reflecting the distance between his intentions and how he was perceived. The first few moments may have seemed like an isolated incident. Perhaps Harry thought it was nerves, an individual act, or coincidence. But as the lineup progressed, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Veteran after veteran stepped past him, their posture formal, but their gestures deliberate. Some avoided eye contact entirely. Some exchanged subtle glances with each other, as if confirming a collective decision. The symbolism was crushing. For a man who had built a career on empathy, connection, and public service, this silent refusal was a revelation. Celebrity and legacy cannot substitute for authenticity. Even those in the media observed it. Camera operators whispered to each other, adjusting angles to capture every nuance. Journalists jotted notes, sensing a story far bigger than a missed handshake. Social media users, live streaming snippets, began to speculate. Headlines like Prince Harry snubbed by veterans and Handshake rejected began trending within minutes. The optics were devastating. But the truth, as always, was more layered. It wasn't merely about embarrassment. It was about principle. The veterans weren't acting out of malice. They were acting out of expectation, out of experience, out of respect for what service really meant. And for Harry, the lesson was immediate, personal, and unforgettable. Then came the most striking moment. A veteran, older than most in the room, stepped forward to meet Harry. A man who had served decades ago, someone who Harry had once publicly praised, someone whose respect had been a badge of honor. And when Harry extended his hand, the man hesitated. He shook it briefly, but his eyes spoke volumes: disappointment, judgment, and restraint. The cameras caught it all. The media captured it. The public would see it. But what most would not realize was the private calculation behind that handshake. Decades of experience, personal pride, and a lifetime of service distilled into a single, measured action. And in that action, Harry must have felt the sting of his choices, his image, and the contrast between perception and reality. How does one reconcile public adulation with private judgment? How does a man accustomed to praise handle rejection from the very people he sought to honor? These are the questions that hung in the air that morning. And yet, the story didn't end there. Because while the handshake was the public moment, the private moments, whispered conversations, subtle gestures, and unspoken decisions were the real story. Behind the closed doors of the venue, aides and staffers scrambled to manage the optics, to protect Harry's image, to maintain a semblance of dignity. But the veterans, calm and resolute, had made their statement. And it would resonate far beyond the hall, far beyond Toronto, far beyond a simple handshake. The scene in Toronto was more than a rejection. It was a signal that the public, especially those who had lived the realities of service and sacrifice, were no longer willing to be impressed by titles or media narratives. They demanded authenticity, integrity, and respect. And when those demands were not met, they acted. Silently, powerfully, indelibly. For Harry, the implications were staggering. Not only had his image taken a hit, but the message was clear: respect is fragile. Admiration can be revoked. Legacy can be questioned. And the consequences, even in a single handshake, can be far-reaching. But the most shocking part of all wasn't just the rejection itself. It was what came immediately after, when the cameras briefly cut away and private discussions unfolded behind the scenes. Words were exchanged. Decisions were questioned. And one veteran's quiet statement would reverberate across the room and into the public consciousness in ways no one anticipated. Because sometimes, the silence of a handshake says more than 1,000 speeches. And what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Have you ever wondered what it feels like to walk into a room where everyone once cheered your name, only to realize that those cheers have turned into whispers of doubt? That was Prince Harry's reality in Toronto, though it wasn't something that happened overnight. To understand the weight of that rejected handshake, we need to step back and look at the history, the foundation of Harry's relationship with Canada, the country that had once embraced him as one of its own. Canada and Harry shared a long, complicated history. His first visits had been marked by admiration, excitement, and genuine warmth. Veterans remembered him attending ceremonies, speaking at Invictus Games events, and engaging with wounded soldiers in a way that was personal and impactful. The Invictus Games, after all, weren't just a royal vanity project. They were Harry's attempt to bridge his military past with public service, to shine a light on the sacrifices of those who had risked everything. Canadians had recognized that effort. They had admired it. They had celebrated it. And for years, Harry had been more than a prince in the headlines. He had been a symbol, a figure of hope and acknowledgement for veterans, an ally in a world that often overlooked them. But admiration is fragile. It can be earned with heroic deeds, kind words, and personal sacrifice. And it can be lost in the smallest moments, the tiniest missteps, and the most subtle signals of self-interest. For Harry, the loss began slowly, almost imperceptibly. What Canadians and veterans had first embraced was the man who had served, who had sacrificed, and who had consistently shown empathy. Over time, however, public perception shifted. Media scrutiny intensified. Netflix contracts, legal battles, and public revelations about the royal family became intertwined with his image. To some, he was no longer the soldier prince who walked among them. He had become a celebrity, a brand, and in the eyes of a select few, a man whose actions sometimes contradicted his rhetoric. The Toronto event was meant to be a return to form. It was supposed to be a celebration, a reaffirmation of mutual respect. Veterans, organizers, and staff had meticulously planned the day, highlighting Harry's accomplishments, the purpose of his visit, and the continuing importance of the Invictus Games. But the crowd's reactions revealed a different story. Whispers turned into cautious glances, hesitant handshakes, and subtle refusals. Those who had once admired him began questioning his intentions. Was this visit about honor, or was it about image management? Was he here to reconnect, or to perform for cameras? The distinction, subtle as it may seem, was crucial, and it had not gone unnoticed by the veterans. Harry's past in Canada had set a high bar. He had been welcomed at military bases, cheered at events, and photographed with countless veterans. These moments had been iconic. Veterans had shared stories of personal conversations, of Harry taking the time to listen, to acknowledge sacrifices that others overlooked. Canadians had trusted him, respected him, and even defended him in the media. This trust, however, came with expectations, sincerity, humility, and genuine engagement. A prince who had once walked among them could not now act as if admiration was automatic. And yet, that is precisely what happened on that fateful morning. The irony is sharp. Harry, who had cultivated an image of authenticity, found himself confronted with the ultimate test: real human judgment. Not headlines, not television commentary, not Instagram posts. Real people, veterans who had lived through real trauma, who had served under impossible conditions, who had sacrificed in ways most of us cannot imagine, were silently evaluating him. They were assessing whether the man standing before them still embodied the values he had once championed. And when he extended his hand, expecting the warmth and recognition he had once received, they gave him silence instead. It's important to understand that the silence wasn't an accident. It wasn't a moment of forgetfulness or distraction. The veterans had made a deliberate choice. Some had personal grievances, some had witnessed public behavior they couldn't reconcile with their ideals, and some simply refused to be impressed by royal status or celebrity. Every step Harry took that morning, every handshake he extended, was met with either avoidance or muted compliance. It was a collective statement, subtle yet unmistakable. Respect must be earned, not assumed. And yet, there were flashes of memory in that crowd. Some veterans recalled the days when Harry had truly been one of them, when his presence brought hope and visibility to those who had long been overlooked. They remembered his laughter, his willingness to engage personally, his humility. That contrast, the memory of past connection versus the reality of the present, made the rejection sting even more. It was a reminder that time, perception, and actions matter. Legacy is not static. It is constantly evaluated, constantly measured against current behavior. Social media amplified the moment, as it always does. Videos of the handshake circulated widely, accompanied by comments ranging from astonishment to mockery to disbelief. People debated whether it was intentional, a misunderstanding, or a reflection of Harry's shifting public image. Yet the veterans themselves remained largely silent in the immediate aftermath, allowing their actions to speak louder than words. In doing so, they reminded the world that sometimes silence is the most powerful message of all. This wasn't the first time Harry had faced scrutiny, but it was one of the most personal. The rejection of a handshake by someone you've worked to honor is far more potent than a negative headline. It is immediate. It is intimate. It is public and private at the same time. For Harry, the realization must have been sobering. Admiration and respect are conditional. They cannot be commanded, they cannot be purchased, and they cannot be assumed based on past deeds alone. The layers of this incident extend beyond personal embarrassment. They touch on themes of trust, responsibility, and perception. How does a man who has lived a life in the public eye reconcile moments when the public, or those who represent its values, no longer embrace him? How does he respond to quiet, deliberate judgment when the stakes are not just his image, but the values he claims to represent? These are questions that transcend one individual, touching on universal human experiences, the gap between expectation and reality, the consequences of misaligned actions, and the necessity of authentic connection. But the story doesn't end with hesitation or averted eyes. What followed immediately after the handshake rejection revealed even deeper layers of tension. Behind the cameras, discussions took place in hushed tones. Security personnel, aides, and event coordinators exchanged worried glances. Some tried to reassure Harry, to redirect attention, to salvage what they could of the public narrative. But the veterans had already made their position clear. Their subtle refusal to engage was both a judgment and a lesson. It was a reminder that authority, fame, and past service do not guarantee ongoing respect. And yet, even in the midst of rejection, there were nuances that complicated the narrative. Not every veteran ignored Harry. Some greeted him warmly, others hesitated, and still others offered polite but measured acknowledgement. These micro-interactions revealed the complexity of human judgment. It wasn't black and white. It wasn't a uniform boycott. It was a spectrum of response, influenced by individual experiences, perceptions, and expectations. And within that spectrum, Harry's awareness of both acceptance and rejection created an emotional tension that few outside the room could fully appreciate. The media captured everything, and yet, it only told part of the story. Public perception was forming in real time, amplified by commentary and speculation. Social media reactions ranged from ridicule to sympathy to deep analysis. Some questioned Harry's intentions, others defended his legacy, and a few recognized the symbolic weight of the moment. The narrative was unfolding across multiple platforms simultaneously, and Harry was at the center of it, both as subject and as observer. But perhaps the most significant aspect of this chapter was the personal impact on Harry himself. A man who has spent decades under public scrutiny, who has experienced both adulation and criticism, who has fought for causes he believed in, suddenly faced a moment where the judgment was undeniable, immediate, and profoundly personal. The rejection of a handshake. A simple, universal gesture of respect revealed a chasm between expectation and reality, between persona and perception. It was a moment of reckoning. And then came the subtle, quiet act that would be remembered long after the cameras stopped rolling. One veteran, someone Harry had once praised publicly, offered a brief handshake, but his eyes were filled with something more complex than a greeting. Disappointment, judgment, and restrained emotion met Harry's gesture. It was a handshake, yes, but it was also a statement, a reminder, a challenge. And in that single, fleeting interaction, the reality of the situation crystallized. Harry's legacy in Canada was no longer secure. Respect had to be rebuilt, trust had to be restored, and his public image was under scrutiny not just by the media, but by those whose lives he had claimed to honor. What happens when admiration turns to hesitation? When applause becomes silence? When a handshake becomes a judgment? For Prince Harry, Toronto was the test. And while the public moment was dramatic, the private consequences were even more profound. Behind the scenes, whispers grew louder. Observers noted subtle shifts in body language, tension among aides, and a sense that the event had gone far beyond mere ceremonial protocol. This was more than embarrassment. It was a moment of reckoning. And just when it seemed like the tension had reached its peak, something unexpected occurred. A veteran who had been observing quietly stepped forward, leaning in slightly, offering a word that was captured by only a few microphones. It was not praise. It was not scolding. It was a quiet, deliberate reminder that would haunt Harry, and it was just the beginning. Because the story of that handshake, the rejection, the subtle judgment, the silent rebuke, was far from over. What came next would expose even deeper truths about perception, loyalty, and consequence. And no one, not even Harry, was prepared for it. What happens when good intentions collide with public expectation? When a promise, built on years of effort and sacrifice, meets the cold, unforgiving scrutiny of those it was meant to honor. That was the challenge Prince Harry faced, not just in Toronto, but across the entirety of his relationship with the military community. To understand why the rejected handshake stung so profoundly, we need to revisit the foundation of his legacy, the Invictus Games. The Invictus Games weren't born from a desire for recognition. They were born from experience, from understanding firsthand what service members endure, what they sacrifice, and how their struggles often go unseen. Harry had walked alongside soldiers, in Afghanistan's deserts and in the quiet corridors of military hospitals, witnessing pain, courage, and resilience. He had seen the long-term toll of war, the invisible wounds, the daily battles, the courage that went unnoticed by the world. And it was these experiences that shaped the Invictus Games. The goal was simple yet profound: to give veterans a platform to compete, to showcase their strength, to find healing through sport and camaraderie. Canada had embraced this vision wholeheartedly. Cities across the country had hosted participants, spectators had cheered, and communities had rallied to honor the athletes who had given so much. Veterans who had once walked past him in ceremonial lines now shared stories of personal interaction, moments when Harry had listened, had joked, had acknowledged sacrifices in a way that few others would. Those experiences had created a bond. Canadians weren't just fans, they were believers. They had trusted that Harry's commitment to the military community was genuine. And for years, it had been. But trust, like respect, is fragile. And over time, cracks had begun to appear. Media coverage, celebrity exposure, and the constant scrutiny of public life started to complicate the narrative. The more Harry's profile expanded, the more his actions were interpreted through the lens of fame rather than sincerity. The cancellation of projects, the legal battles, the public statements criticizing institutions he once supported, all of it created a perception that Harry's priorities might have shifted. And perceptions matter. In Canada, where veterans are deeply respected, even subtle misalignment between words and actions can carry enormous weight. At the Toronto event, the echoes of these perceptions were clear. Veterans weren't ignoring Harry out of malice. They were responding to a gap between promise and reality. The handshake that was refused symbolized more than personal embarrassment. It symbolized the tension between expectation and action, between the ideals Harry had championed and the perception of how he was currently conducting himself. Every avoidance, every averted gaze, was a reminder that the bond built through Invictus, though significant, was not indestructible. And yet, there was undeniable irony. The games themselves continued to thrive, bringing together athletes, supporters, and communities. The principles Harry had championed, resilience, courage, and healing, remained at the heart of Invictus. The contrast between the enduring legacy of the games and the personal rebuke he received that day was stark. On one hand, a thriving institution celebrated globally. On the other, a personal interaction that exposed vulnerability, rejection, and the fragility of public favor. The juxtaposition was almost cinematic: a hero of the games, a figure who had brought attention to veteran struggles, silently rebuffed by the very people whose lives he sought to honor. It's important to understand the psychology behind this moment. Veterans, unlike celebrities, do not operate on media optics. They value consistency, authenticity, and alignment between actions and words. Harry's presence in Toronto was meant to signal continued support, yet some perceived it as performative. The public gestures, while grand and media-friendly, could not substitute for the perception of genuine, ongoing engagement. And when Harry's hand extended in greeting, the silent refusals acted as a mirror, reflecting not only his current image but also the expectations he had failed, in some way, to meet. Imagine being the veteran who declined the handshake. Decades of service, experiences that most civilians cannot comprehend, moments of bravery under fire. And here stood a prince, a figure they once admired, now appearing more as a celebrity than a comrade. The refusal was not just a personal statement. It was a symbolic one. Honor must be matched by authenticity. The silent judgment was a powerful reminder that status, fame, or even legacy could not replace lived experience and the respect it demands. And for Harry, the moment must have been devastating. This was a man who had built his life around public service, who had tried to bridge worlds between royalty and military, celebrity and service. To be rebuffed, quietly yet unmistakably, in a public setting was more than embarrassment. It was a signal that the relationship he had cultivated, nurtured, and showcased for years was under scrutiny, and that scrutiny was unforgiving. But there is more to the Invictus story than rejection. It is a story of profound resilience, of athletes overcoming physical and emotional trauma to compete, to inspire, to show the world that human courage cannot be measured solely by appearances or accolades. Harry had created a platform that celebrated strength and determination, but in doing so, he had also created expectations. Expectations that his actions would consistently align with the principles he espoused. And when those expectations were questioned, the resulting judgment, even in the form of a simple ignored handshake, carried enormous emotional weight. Veterans who participated in the games remember Harry's engagement vividly. They recall his jokes, his encouragement, his personal attention. They recall moments when he paused to acknowledge their struggle, moments when he lifted spirits through empathy rather than ceremony. Those memories are what made the rejection so poignant. The contrast between past connection and present distancing created a tension that resonated not only in Toronto, but across the media landscape. It was a moment where legacy, expectation, and reality collided in a very public and undeniable way. But there is a contradiction here. The Invictus Games continued to shine. Athletes competed, communities celebrated, and global attention remained high. The institution Harry had built was thriving. Yet he, the figurehead, faced subtle yet crushing rebuke from the very people the games were meant to honor. The irony is sharp. The mission succeeded even as the messenger faltered. And that irony, subtle yet bitter, shaped the narrative of Harry's Toronto visit in ways that headlines alone could not capture. What makes this moment even more compelling is the human element. The veterans were not merely passive participants. They were active evaluators, weighing Harry's current actions against a history of engagement. Each decision, each gesture, each public statement contributed to the perception that had culminated in the handshake's rejection. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't malice. It was accountability. It was a reminder that when you work with people whose lives have been defined by integrity, the bar is higher and misalignment is noticed instantly. And then came the subtle signals that the media largely missed. Behind the cameras, veterans exchanged glances, small nods, and quiet murmurs. Security personnel sensed the tension but could do little to mitigate it. Harry, aware of the atmosphere, likely felt a shift in energy that few outside the room could understand. The event had become more than a ceremonial visit. It was a judgment day, a test of credibility, and a reflection of both past and present actions. Every interaction, every glance, every micro-gesture carried significance. In the middle of this tension, one detail stood out: the way Harry's body language shifted as he moved from veteran to veteran. Initially confident, poised, and accustomed to public adulation, he gradually became more tentative. His smiles were smaller, his handshakes slightly awkward, his posture subtly defensive. This was a man confronted not with media scrutiny, not with headline writers, but with lived human judgment. And it revealed a vulnerability rarely seen by the public. A vulnerability that would resonate, amplified, through media, social channels, and public discourse for days. And then, just as the tension seemed insurmountable, a moment occurred that would define the visit in a deeply symbolic way. One veteran, someone Harry had previously interacted with, stepped forward. Their handshake was brief but heavy with meaning. Eyes met, and for a split second, no words were exchanged, yet a message was communicated. Acknowledgement tempered by judgment, respect conditional, admiration questioned. In that brief, fleeting moment, the complexity of human connection, legacy, and perception crystallized. Harry's role as the figurehead of Invictus was not negated, but his personal reception was far more nuanced than anyone outside the room could perceive. And that is the paradox of the promise of Invictus. A platform that celebrates triumph, courage, and resilience can thrive even as its creator faces scrutiny, rejection, and judgment. The games succeed because the athletes succeed. The legacy endures because human courage endures. But for Harry, the personal lesson was profound. Admiration is not guaranteed. Respect is not automatic. And no matter the size of your platform, no matter the breadth of your public acclaim, the human element, the lived experience of those you seek to honor, cannot be overlooked. And just when it seemed that Harry had absorbed the full weight of the rejection, an unexpected development unfolded behind the scenes. A private conversation, whispered but overheard by a few, hinted at deeper grievances, hidden history, and unresolved tensions that had been simmering beneath the surface for years. This wasn't merely about a handshake or a single visit. It was about legacy, credibility, and accountability in a world where perception can shift faster than intention. And what came next would challenge not only Harry's public persona, but the very foundations of trust he had tried to build over a lifetime. Have you ever had a moment where you thought everything was under control, only to realize that behind the scenes, the ground was shifting beneath your feet? That's precisely the kind of revelation Prince Harry faced in London, just days before his Toronto visit. While the public saw pomp, ceremony, and the trappings of royalty, the private meetings told a far more complicated story, one that would foreshadow the tension, the rebuke, and the silence he encountered in Canada. The meeting in London was supposed to be routine. Advisors, event coordinators, and members of the Invictus Games team gathered in a quiet conference room, far from the glare of cameras. Harry entered, confident yet aware of the stakes. He had traveled extensively in preparation for Toronto, had rehearsed speeches, coordinated media coverage, and thought through every interaction with veterans. But what he didn't anticipate was how complicated the expectations had become. Not from the public, not from the press, but from the very people whose admiration he had relied upon for years, those intimately connected to the Invictus Games, Canadian military leaders, and veteran representatives. The conversation began cordially. Advisors briefed Harry on the schedule, the crowd composition, the VIP attendees, and the media strategy. A checklist, meticulously crafted, outlined every handshake, every photo opportunity, every soundbite. On the surface, everything was perfectly orchestrated. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. One veteran liaison, seated quietly in the corner, raised concerns about the optics of the visit. "It's not just about the events," he said softly. "It's about how you're perceived. And right now, perception is fragile." Fragile. That word echoed in Harry's mind, though he tried not to show it. He had faced scrutiny before, yes, but never from those whose judgment carried moral weight rather than media spin. These were people who had lived with sacrifice, who had fought wars, who had witnessed pain in ways most of us cannot imagine. Their assessment wasn't influenced by headlines or tweets. It was grounded in experience. And the first sign that things might be more complicated than he anticipated came when the liaison raised the topic of past grievances, moments Harry hadn't fully considered. "You've been invited, you've been applauded, you've been honored," the liaison continued. "But there are veterans who feel your priorities have shifted. They wonder if the visits, the speeches, the appearances, are they for them or for the cameras?" Harry paused. He had expected logistical concerns, maybe questions about timing, security, or press management. But this was different. It was not just strategy. It was judgment. And judgment cuts deeper than logistical missteps ever could. The meeting then turned to media strategy. Every detail of the Toronto visit had been choreographed, where the cameras would be positioned, which veterans would appear in photos, how soundbites would be managed. Advisors emphasized optics, smiles, handshake angles, moments of eye contact. But the veteran liaison spoke again, this time with quiet firmness. "Harry, optics are not the same as sincerity. The people you meet can see the difference. They will feel it. And if they feel it, you will not be greeted with applause." It was a subtle warning, but for Harry, it was a jolt. Here he was, thinking he had meticulously prepared, assuming that his reputation and past engagement with veterans would carry him through, only to be confronted with the possibility that all his planning might fail. How do you navigate a situation where preparation cannot guarantee reception, where decades of service, public recognition, and personal effort can be overridden by perception and sentiment? Then came the discussion about past controversies. Advisors hesitated before broaching the topic, choosing words carefully. References were made to media narratives, public criticism, and decisions regarding charitable ventures. Harry listened, absorbing the implications. It wasn't just about optics. It was about trust, credibility, and the emotional calculus of the people he sought to honor. What may have seemed like minor missteps to the public could be interpreted as betrayal or negligence by those whose lives had been defined by integrity and sacrifice. The meeting was intense, layered with tension. Advisors reminded Harry that the Toronto event would be scrutinized not just in Canada, but internationally. Every gesture, every word, every handshake would be analyzed. One slip could overshadow years of work. And then came a crucial point. Veterans' opinions, particularly those who had long-standing ties to the games, carried more weight than any media outlet or headline. Their approval could not be assumed. It had to be earned anew, every time, with every interaction. Harry's response was measured but reflective. He recognized the gravity of the warning, but he also believed in the sincerity of his intentions. After all, the Invictus Games had been his passion, his commitment, and his way of giving back to those who had given everything. Yet, for the first time in a long time, he began to realize that passion alone might not be enough. How do you convey sincerity when your life has become a brand, when every appearance is dissected, and when those you wish to honor have already formed judgments based on perception? The conversation then shifted to logistics, but the emotional undercurrent remained palpable. Harry's team mapped out every detail of the Toronto visit, from arrival times to crowd management to press interactions. But each plan was accompanied by subtle cautions from veteran representatives. They will watch the little things, one said. Not just the speeches or photos. Watch how you listen. Watch your reactions. Watch how you respond to rejection. Because these moments matter far more than you realize. And rejection, that word now carried weight in Harry's mind. The meeting had prepared him for challenges, but nothing could fully convey what it would feel like to be quietly rebuked by those he had sought to honor. The liaison's warning lingered in the room. Respect is not automatic. Admiration is conditional. And even when you have given your life in service, in public or in private, it can be questioned in an instant. The meeting in London also revealed a deeper tension, the dichotomy between image and authenticity. Advisors emphasized the need to look the part for the cameras, to project confidence, warmth, and humility. But the veterans reminded Harry that performance could be seen through. They could sense when gestures were calculated, when words were rehearsed, and when actions were driven by optics rather than sincerity. The lesson was clear. Authenticity cannot be faked, and when it is absent, it is noticed immediately. As the discussion drew to a close, Harry was left with an uneasy mix of preparation and apprehension. On one hand, he had meticulously planned every detail of his Toronto visit. On the other, he had been warned, explicitly and subtly, that even perfect execution could fall short if his interactions lacked sincerity. The stakes were higher than he had realized. It wasn't just a ceremonial visit. It was a test of credibility, perception, and the delicate bond he had nurtured with the military community over years. But perhaps the most sobering moment came in the final minutes of the meeting. One veteran liaison, a figure of authority and experience, leaned forward and said quietly, "Harry, you must remember this. These people have seen a lot. They've survived a lot. They can sense when someone is genuine and when someone is performing. And if they sense the latter, it won't end well." Harry absorbed the words, nodding slowly. He understood the warning intellectually, but the emotional impact was profound. For a man who had spent decades in the public eye, who had faced media scrutiny, legal battles, and personal loss, this was different. This was intimate judgment from those whose respect he most valued. It was a mirror showing a side of himself he hadn't fully confronted. And as he left the meeting, the weight of that warning hung over him, like a shadow that would stretch all the way to Toronto. The London meeting was meant to be preparatory, routine, and strategic. Instead, it became a revelation. Harry now understood that the handshake in Toronto was not merely ceremonial. It was symbolic. It carried the weight of perception, history, and expectation, and it would test him in ways no rehearsal, speech, or media strategy could mitigate. As he boarded the plane for Toronto, the words of the liaison echoed in his mind. Even the smallest gestures are amplified when trust is fragile, when admiration is conditional, and when perception outweighs intent. Every smile, every handshake, every interaction would be scrutinized. And the true test wasn't whether he could perform for cameras. It was whether he could earn genuine respect in real time. What Harry did not yet know was that the warnings from London would come to life in Toronto in ways he could never have anticipated. The subtle tensions, the quiet judgment, the legacy he thought secure, all would collide in a single, unforgettable moment. And the consequences of that collision would reverberate far beyond the handshake, far beyond Toronto, and far beyond anything Harry had experienced before. Have you ever noticed how fame can be a double-edged sword? The very thing that opens doors can also close them, sometimes in ways you never expect. For Prince Harry, the shadow of Netflix loomed large over his visit to Toronto, and it wasn't something the cameras could capture. This wasn't just about public appearances or ceremonial handshakes anymore. It was about perception, credibility, and the way ambition can sometimes overshadow intent. The handshake that would later be rejected didn't happen in a vacuum. It was influenced by years of media scrutiny, high-profile deals, and a public persona increasingly linked with celebrity rather than service. And at the center of it all stood Netflix. The deal with Netflix had been unprecedented. Millions of dollars, multi-year contracts, and a platform that promised to showcase Harry and Meghan's story to the world. At first glance, it seemed like a natural progression. The couple would share their philanthropic work, highlight causes they cared about, and continue to amplify the voices of those often ignored. But the very act of turning a charitable legacy into media content introduced a complication that was impossible to ignore. The public, especially those who had previously respected Harry's work with veterans, began questioning motivations. Were the project's genuine efforts to highlight meaningful stories, or were they carefully curated media spectacles designed to enhance the brand? Veterans, in particular, noticed the shift. They had once seen Harry as one of their own, someone who understood sacrifice, courage, and service. The Invictus Games, founded and championed by Harry, had been a platform that celebrated their achievements, not his. But Netflix introduced a new dynamic. The audience was now global, the stakes were monetary, and every interaction risked being interpreted as performative. Veterans began whispering that the focus had shifted from them to the optics, from celebration to self-promotion. And in Toronto, those whispers manifested in subtle yet unmistakable ways, like the handshake that was quietly declined. The shadow of Netflix wasn't just public perception. Internally, tensions had begun to simmer. Advisors debated every aspect of Harry's involvement with media, weighing the benefits of visibility against the risk of alienating the very communities he sought to support. Some argued that the platform could amplify the Invictus Games and provide unprecedented exposure for veteran stories. Others cautioned that commercial and celebrity associations might dilute the authenticity of his work. The tension between image management and genuine engagement had reached a tipping point. By the time Harry arrived in Toronto, the Netflix shadow was already influencing reactions, even before a single handshake occurred. Consider the optics from the veteran's perspective. Here was a man they had once admired, the founder of the Invictus Games, appearing in a city they had embraced, yet increasingly associated with lucrative media deals rather than direct service. The distinction between intention and perception is subtle, but it matters enormously. When someone's credibility is tied to actions that are seen as self-serving, even unintentionally, the response is immediate. The handshake, the silent refusal, was not just about Harry's presence. It was about what he represented in that moment, a mixture of legacy, celebrity, and commercial endeavor. And there was irony here. Harry had created a platform to honor resilience and courage, to highlight those who had sacrificed everything. And yet the very mechanism designed to amplify that platform introduced suspicion. Netflix, with its global audience and high production values, unintentionally raised questions about authenticity. Were the veterans being honored, Or were they props in a media narrative? Could the stories of real human struggle be filtered through the lens of entertainment? And if so, who was truly being served, the heroes or the brand? This isn't to say that Harry's intentions were insincere. Many who worked closely with him insisted he remained deeply committed to veterans' causes, even amidst the high-profile media deals. But perception, as always, is reality. And perception, in the world of military service and veteran recognition, is unforgiving. When a platform becomes more visible than the people it celebrates, judgment is swift. And so, the handshake in Toronto was not merely a ceremonial gesture. It was the culmination of years of complex dynamics, amplified by the presence of global media, and, yes, shadowed by the Netflix deal. The story becomes even more layered when considering the timing. News of Netflix contracts had dominated headlines, sparking debates about celebrity, accountability, and authenticity. Some critics argued that Harry had commercialized his past, transforming genuine engagement with service members into content for streaming. Others defended him, emphasizing the scale and visibility the platform provided to causes that might otherwise be ignored. But veterans, who experienced the tangible realities of sacrifice daily, were less swayed by media narratives. They evaluated actions, consistency, and alignment with values. And in their eyes, a platform designed to entertain, even with noble intentions, raised questions. There were internal discussions at the Toronto venue as well. Staffers and aides noted the subtle tension, the quiet judgment, the energy of the veterans as Harry approached. "They're watching everything," one whispered. "Every word, every gesture, every smile." And in the midst of that observation, the shadow of Netflix lingered. Every handshake, every comment, every photograph risked being interpreted through a dual lens: service and celebrity, intention and perception. Harry had to navigate not just human judgment, but the layered scrutiny of media, branding, and public expectation. Yet even within this tension, there were moments of clarity. Veterans who had interacted with Harry in the past recognized the sincerity of certain gestures, the earnestness in his engagement, the historical commitment he had shown. But those moments were juxtaposed against the backdrop of media exposure, contractual obligations, and high-profile deals. It created a contradiction that complicated every interaction. Harry was both the champion of the Invictus Games and the subject of global celebrity scrutiny, a duality that would ultimately shape the reception in Toronto. And here's the human truth. No one could have predicted precisely how this would manifest. The handshake, the silence, the subtle rejections, they were the visible consequences of invisible forces. Veterans were not reacting solely to the present moment. They were responding to years of perception, experience, and observation. The Netflix deal wasn't the cause of the rejection, but it was part of the context, part of the framework through which actions were interpreted. And Harry, unaware of the full emotional calculus, was about to experience its weight firsthand. By the time the Toronto event unfolded, the shadow of Netflix had already shaped expectations. Veterans approached the interaction with caution, skepticism, and discernment. Every handshake, every glance, every gesture was carefully evaluated. Harry, despite his extensive preparation and historical credibility, was navigating an environment where perception was paramount, where authenticity could not be assumed, and where even well-intentioned actions risked being misread. And then came the moment that would define the visit. Harry extended his hand toward the first veteran in line, a gesture meant to convey respect, recognition, and connection. But perception outweighed intention. The handshake was declined. The veteran's eyes looked past him, subtly signaling judgment. The cameras captured it. The media noticed it. Social media exploded with commentary, speculation, and debate. And in that instant, the abstract consequences of celebrity, media deals, and perception collided with the tangible reality of human judgment. But the Netflix shadow was not done. Behind the scenes, whispers circulated among veterans and aides. Discussions of media strategy, content planning, and future contracts were intertwined with critiques of engagement, authenticity, and sincerity. The rejection was not merely about one gesture. It was about the cumulative weight of perceived priorities, actions, and intentions. And Harry, for the first time in a long while, had to confront the uncomfortable truth that admiration can be conditional, respect can be fleeting, and celebrity does not replace authenticity. As the visit continued, Harry faced repeated moments that echoed this reality. Other veterans hesitated to engage, some offered brief, measured acknowledgement, and a few avoided interaction entirely. The contrast between past admiration and present caution was stark, unyielding, and emotionally potent. Every gesture, every interaction was amplified by the